First of all, I want to thank you for coming here. This is our fall Bible study we're doing, and as you can see, we're trying something new. We're trying to record this. Our plan with all the camera and whatnot is we're going to record this and put it up on YouTube. And what we're trying to do is what we talked about back in the spring, trying to be able to provide some of our option as an on-demand format so that folks that aren't able to come on a Sunday evening can still have access to the material. And so we're giving a trial run for that. Just so you know, unlike our Facebook Live of our service, this is not live. So if any of you say just anything that you would be embarrassed about later, we can edit that out. You don't have to worry about it. If someone like Richard Temple, for instance, were to say something horrible and unloving about a certain pastor's football team, we can absolutely cut that out, and we will. So we're studying the Apostle Paul, and let me just give you a little bit of why this topic is so precious to me. Back in 2001, I was a college student, and I had a class with a professor named Randy Richards on the life and letters of Paul. That single class introduced me so much to how the background, the history of the Bible affects so much of our understanding and our view of the Bible. It really shaped the way that I teach. It shaped the way that I study. It really opened up my interest to direct me to the doctoral program that I was a part of. I'll just say a significant amount of the way that I preach and teach was formed by being in this particular class, because the professor brought Paul's world to life. And so over the years since, the topic has been so interesting to me that I've taught this class myself in different formats several times. I've taught it to pastors in India. I've taught it at my previous church several times in different zones, different formats, and different groups. And so I've tried to kind of pick up and pull from different ways of learning. So I've included pictures. Just about all of the pictures that you'll see are pictures that Rebecca and I have taken. And so we've made it a point. In the pre-children days, we were able to go and travel to a lot of places that we'll read about. And that has been helpful. And the Apostle Paul continues to be probably my favorite particular area of study to zero in on. And so this is just a lot of fun for me. And if I get veering too much into the nerd realm and you say this is not helpful, that'll help me. So just give a wave and say, you know, you're kind of being a nerd. So none of us care about this part. Get back to the big story. And I'll be glad to do that. A couple of things I'll just point out. I like recommending books, and of the writing of books about Paul, there is no end. And so a couple of things. I mentioned to you Randy Richards, my Paul professor from college. This is a textbook that he and a couple of guys wrote called Rediscovering Paul. It's an introduction to his oral letters and theology. It's now out in a second edition. If you pick, say, one book out of this whole thing to read, just to go a little bit deeper on, this is where I would probably say you start. If you want a little bit more of a story in like a biography format, but a little bit bigger challenge, N.T. Wright just came out with a biography on Paul. And he tells Paul's story, worked in as a biography, so he's filling in some guesswork, some puzzle pieces along the way by his best estimation. But he does a great job of telling the story and telling it in a way where you pick up a lot about Paul's world. Now I'll say, N.T. Wright has also written the biggest single book on the Apostle Paul that's ever been written, a 2-volume, 1,600-page book, and I'll show it to you. I'm working through it, and it's I bought it 5 years ago. And I picked it up, and then I got into school, and I put it down, and I'm through with school, and so I picked it back up again. And slow, but a good, like when you have a good meal, you want to chew and get all the flavors. So anyway, so I'll show you that, and we can talk about that. So just a broad view, and I'll try to explain this along the way, but there's an awful lot that we know about Paul and his life. Because of the Bible, because of the Bible contains a great amount of his story through the Acts account. We also have 13 of his letters, and we also, because we see those things kind of laid out, we have a broad sampling of Paul's life. I think we have more of Paul's life than any other Bible character, certainly of any other New Testament character, from having writings of his own and just kind of surveying him over the course of many, many years. So we have a lot that we're able to pick up on about his life. We're also able to surmise quite a lot from that period of history. There's a decent amount that's been preserved in that first century. And so some things that we may not know about Paul, but we can make a pretty good guess on because of the world situation, because of the world in which he lived. And then there's other things that, we are still missing a few puzzle pieces, but we're trying to make our best guess. And fortunately, there's some really good scholars out there that are making good guesses, some of which are being verified with ongoing finds, archaeology finds. Some are being disproven, and then we have to kind of rewrite our estimation. So anyway, I'm going to do my best along the way to point out this we know, this we think, we don't know, but this is a good idea. So if you have any questions about that, interrupt, and I can clarify that along the way. I will have a time every night where we do questions, just in general, and we'll field those, and I'll try to keep them so that if I'm going to answer a question later in the following weeks, I'll say we'll come back to that or that sort of thing. All right, so let's get into Paul's world just a little bit. I think it's helpful to think about Paul inhabiting three worlds that shaped his ministry. One is the Roman Empire. Rome is the government. They're the ones who are in charge. They're the powers that be. And they were at the early stage of the Roman Empire, so the emperor was the godfather for the entire empire. He was the one who made the rules, who set the rules. There was a senate, but many times it was the emperor, depending on which one. He had quite a bit of sway. Now, in some cases, Rome was a very brutal empire, but there were some benefits to having such a powerful empire. One is what's called the Pax Romana, Roman peace. Rome really recognized the security in keeping things under control. Their idea was if we can prohibit mobs from rising, then we can keep our power in localized places. If we can keep everybody in order, we can control the masses. And so they worked really hard to keep peace along daily life in each day. They worked really hard to keep peace between regional conflicts. They would go in and try to stamp those out if there's ever a problem. One of the things that they did in order to keep the peace was they built a fantastic road system, many of which are still there to this day. They're very solid stone roads, and the reason they built those roads was in order to deploy their armies quickly to go and to squelch any rebellion. So Rome built the infrastructure primarily for their military purposes. Of course, that served Paul in a lot of ways as he's traveling overland. Another thing that Rome provided Paul is Rome had a lot of shipping going on. They had grain ships coming from the Middle East, from Egypt in particular, working their way through the Mediterranean to bring grain to Rome. At various points in the Roman Empire, the government provided free bread to the citizens. And then as you get in later, actually, toward the end of the empire, they were giving out free meat even, not just to citizens, but even to some of the free persons there in the city of Rome. So what that meant was they viewed this, and historians call the Mediterranean the Roman lake, because Rome had so many ships going back and forth, getting grain brought, but also just bringing goods. The commercial value of shipping was huge. Paul took advantage of that. So that was one world that Paul inhabited. Next was the world of Greece. Remember, before the Roman Empire had come to power, the Greeks had taken over much of the Mediterranean world. Alexander the Great in the 300 BCs had come and taken over. And what they did, they came in and they said, all right, everyone's going to be like us. We want everybody to speak Greek, to think Greek, and to live a Greek sort of life. And so they imposed their culture. The word is Hellenization. They imposed their culture wherever they conquered. And so you can go to not just Greece, but to Turkey and to Israel and to various parts throughout the Middle East where Alexander the Great had conquered. And now you still see Greek ruins there. You see the buildings were built in a Greek sort of style. Now, the benefit was that you go from one city to another and things kind of look the same way and tend to work the same way, but also you've got a common language that bonds everybody together. Everyone is speaking Greek, or at least a great number of the people, the educated people, speak Greek. And so kind of like English to this day. English is the commercial language of our world for now. And so you can go a lot of places and find people that don't speak English, but if you go to a city anywhere in the world, you can be confident that you'll probably run into somebody that has at least a working knowledge of English. It's very much the same way in Paul's world. And so people were able to communicate. He was able to write across provincial lines to different countries, to different continents, using the one language that they all shared. This isn't to say they didn't have their own language. They absolutely did. But Greek is what they spoke to get business done. The third world is the Jewish world. See, Paul was part of a tradition. He was part of a people that identified themselves as the unique people of God. That shaped how Paul lived. That shaped the family that he grew up in. That shaped the way that he viewed time even. He didn't view time as a series of ongoing cycles the way that the rest of the world did. The Jewish people very much saw time as linear, moving from creation to the time when God fixes creation. There's some variations in how they thought God was going to do that, and we'll get into that along the way. But Judaism was a unique worldview that was different than almost anything else in a number of ways. So it shaped how he viewed the world. It shaped how he understood the events going on of his life, and it also shaped his expectations for the world. Now that's kind of the talking stuff. That's kind of dry. So a picture is worth 1,000 words. So let's get in and look. These are some pictures from Pompeii. Pompeii was destroyed, if you remember, in 79 AD. That's about 15 years or so after Paul is believed to have died. And so just a few pictures to see just kind of what he would have seen, perhaps. Pompeii is kind of like a living time capsule. It was covered over by ash from the volcano, and then it's been in a state of continuous excavation since the 1700s. And so they're still uncovering more and more there. A number of times along the way, I'm going to supplement with a few Pompeii pictures because it shows us some of the things that Paul might have seen at different points. All right, so this is just a mosaic in the floor. You can see a couple of doves there, or pigeons, just to give an idea. Beautiful mosaic covered floors all over the place. Sometimes they were rather interesting, like this one. This is at the house of the tragic poet. That's an entryway into a middle to wealthy person's home. And that dog has a little chain, if you see it kind of going up. And in Latin below, it says, "Beware of the dog." So people are not so different from us. In many of their homes, they would have frescoes on the wall. This is from a dining hall showing a hunting scene. So you see some lions up top and some bulls down below. There's a lot of different variations. This was one of the most ornate of the mosaics that we saw there. But this was very much part of the culture. If you think about Paul just inhabiting a world of bland stone walls, you're not having the right picture. The Romans loved color. They loved decor. And so their houses would be very brightly colored. They would live a very colorful life. Even in small towns. Pompeii, by the way, was only about 10,000 in population, is a general estimate right now. Here's a laundromat. They had a big tub there. They would do laundry. They would wash it. Now I'm going to just say, sometimes we're going to be unfiltered in this class because it's history and it helps us. So what they would use for cleaning the laundry was urine, human urine, because it had ammonia in it. And so they would use that. They would roll it out and dry it. It's not really the way that I get my laundry done, but it worked for them. This, you can't make it out there, but that is a bit of graffiti. In Pompeii to this day, there are about 11,000 different inscriptions, graffiti inscriptions that are there, one of which references Sodom and Gomorrah. This one is a political statement. It's in favor of some politician. But you see different things. This actually gives us a lot of info about the world of Pompeii and how things were done. You can see guys trash talking in one piece of inscription or one piece of graffiti that's there.
So that's graffiti from before the volcano?
Yes, yes. This is Roman era graffiti. Yeah, good question. Okay, this is in a baker's house in Pompeii. So you see the stone mills. They would have either a slave or an animal that would push a beam sticking out from that top. You look how the two stones at the back, they kind of come up and out. What you would do is you would pour the grain in the top of it, and then that stone, it's actually two stones. One that sits on top, it's kind of concave and sits on top like that. And when you turn the stone, it would grind the corn or whatever grain has there. And then the baker would be able to use that and put that in his oven and make whatever bread or whatever else he's making that day. Looks a lot like a modern day pizza oven. Now, interestingly enough, at one of the baker shops there has been evidence of a cross that's been found, indicating, this is a new wave just in the last few years, that these were Christians, that there was a Christian presence in Pompeii. Now, this goes against the majority view, but a guy down at Baylor, Richard Longenecker, has argued real persuasively for this. So, very, very interesting stuff there. So here's a street in Pompeii. You can see the crosswalk, the raised stones there. That would keep you out of the muck and mire that was sure to accumulate there in the street. Sometimes because that's where people dump their bedpans. Some homes, nicer homes, did have an indoor plumbing of sorts. And then at the bathhouses they did as well. We'll see some of that from Ephesus. These are the gates of Pompeii. You can see it as it goes out of the city. You can see the road there a little bit. And I've got another example of a road. This is in Israel in the town of Sepphoris. This is about 6 miles from Nazareth. And this is, again, another Roman road there in that town. And so you can see these are sturdy roads. They're providing just a great infrastructure for Paul to be able to use as he's carrying out his ministry. So, you get a sense of Paul's world. Let's talk about Paul himself for a little bit. Paul was born in Tarsus, and we're going to estimate that he was born in approximately 0 AD. This is a guess. I should say it's an approximate guess. Now, he identified himself in Philemon 9 as an elder or as an old man. The term can be recognized both as kind of a position, but also as a stage of life. And that's really a better way of understanding it. So it would have put him somewhere between 56 and 63 years old if you kind of look at a lot of the ways that the writers of the time break down the different stages of life. They would look at a child or a baby, a child, a young boy, a young man, and they have different terms all the way up. And so by most estimates, that would be about right, 56 to 63, and approximately 62 when he writes that.
What's the
Lee?
life expectancy at this time?
Good question. Life expectancy was an interesting thing because it depends. If you're a slave, probably not great. If you're a woman, not great. Childbirth took down the mortality rates for women significantly. Children died by exposure, intentionally being left out if they were the wrong gender or if the family didn't want them, if they were sick, had any kind of illness. So overall, that really cuts your mortality rates down or cuts your life expectancy down. If you're a healthy man, it's not uncommon to see men that are in their 60s or even their 80s. That's the last stage in the typical stages of life is a man up 80 plus. So, it happened. I could do more research to get an estimate, but that's really about what we do. So it really differs. So wealthy men are going to be who lives the longest. So good question. So if we get an idea, just for our math, it really is a lot simpler if we just put Paul at 0, and that'll give us a workable estimate for the age that he is. Now, we learned some things from Paul's own writing. We learned that Paul was raised according to the Jewish law, strictly. He was circumcised on the 8th day. His father was a Pharisee. He was a Pharisee. He was strictly devoted to learning Scripture. Now, a lot of New Testament guys, a lot of Paul scholars, look at Paul and look at the way that he quotes Old Testament Scripture, the way that he alludes to it, and many of them have come out and said, Paul probably memorized a significant amount of Scripture. Some have said he may have memorized the entire book of Deuteronomy. Some have suggested he probably memorized the entire Torah, the Pentateuch, Genesis through Deuteronomy. And that seems to be very much in fitting with what would have been expected for a Pharisee, or for anyone that was strictly devoted to the law. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the different groups, some of the different sects, that's S-E-C-T-S, of Judaism, because there's kind of your common Judaism that, most of the farmers and fishermen, everybody is, they just go about doing their life. But then there's some groups within Judaism that have a very particular political bent, a very particular way of understanding Judaism. And the whole argument is that things are not the way that they should be in the Jewish world. They go back and they say, we used to have a kingdom. And God promised that He was going to use us to bless the whole world. What happened? It was because we stopped obeying God. And God withdrew his hand. God left the temple. We read about that in Ezekiel 10. And so that's why the Babylonians were able to come and to destroy the temple, destroy Jerusalem, and take our forefathers into captivity. After that, after they get back, they're constantly trying to get their kingdom back, to get their independence. They are granted it for a time, but they never see God's presence come back to the temple. And they never experience going back to their golden age, we might say. So they're looking at the world saying, God's promised to make us great so that the rest of the world can be blessed through us. So why has it not happened? Well, maybe it's our fault. Maybe we have to clean up our act first, and then God's going to use us to bless the world. And so there's different ways, these different groups, these different sects are trying to lead the rest of the people, say, this is what we've got to do to be God's people the way we're supposed to be, and then God's going to return to us. Kind of if we act good enough, God's going to come and then he'll be ready to deal with us once again. Now this is different. This isn't earning their way to heaven. They think they're already chosen because God has chosen their people. But what they're saying is, for God to carry on with his fixing plan for the world, we need to get our act straight. And so there's different groups that are going to disagree about how that's to be done. Paul is a Pharisee, and they had a particular view of that was all about ritual purity, maintaining adherence to the law. And so they studied and they knew the law, and they sought to live it by their particular interpretation. And we'll see some of that come out along the way. Now, Paul was raised in Tarsus, but he was sent down to Jerusalem in order to continue his studies. He studied there under Gamaliel. And I don't have this quote on my note sheet by mistake, but you'll see there on your paper, if you've got the blanks, there's a quote from Strabo. He's a Greek writer, and he was talking about Tarsus. He wrote about 20 AD. And he talked about the habit in Tarsus. Tarsus was well known as a center for education, and it was normal for the people there in Tarsus to be raised up, to go through, like, for lack of a better term, like an elementary school where they would learn reading, maybe some basic writing. They would be exposed to some of the key Greek thinkers, and then they would continue their education abroad. Paul, interestingly, does that. So there's some debate over what kind of education Paul may have had. Was he in a Greek school? There's some argument for it. Another argument may be that the Jewish people had their own schooling system that maybe was modeled on the Greek system. And that's how he learned the scriptures, and that's how in particularly he learned the Greek copy of the scriptures, the Septuagint. So there's a lot of debate around Paul's education, how it was. One thing that's clear is he knew the scriptures well, and he seems to model what was done in his hometown, because he goes to study at Gamaliel, or goes to study at Jerusalem under Gamaliel. You see that reference in Acts 22. Gamaliel is later mentioned 200 years later in the Mishnah. He's called the beauty of the law. He was like the Yale education of Paul's day. Paul studied under the best teacher. We see actually Gamaliel mentioned in Acts 5 where he talks to some of his peers. They're wanting to stone Peter and John, or they're wanting to punish them. And he says, let them go. If this is of God, you won't be able to stop it. So you get a little glimpse. It's a little glimpse that we have of Gamaliel there in Acts. It's a really interesting story. Now, the Bible first mentions Saul in Acts 8:1 at the stoning of Stephen, and he was the one holding the coats. He went on from there to threaten and imprison many who were Christians. And the thing is, we have to understand, he probably thought he was doing God's work. In Judaism, there are two guys, Phineas, and I forget the second one. It'll come to me in a moment. But if you remember the story of Phineas, this is in the book of Judges. Some of the Jewish people, some of the Israelites were intermarrying with the Moabites, the pagans. And God said, y'all are to be separate. You're not to intermarry with them. They're going to lead you down into worshiping idols. And there's an Israelite that takes a Moabite woman and he takes her right to his tent, just very brazenly. And Phineas goes in with a spear and walks in and kills them both out of devotion to God. Says, this is forbidden by God and we're not going to allow it here. That was an example of zeal. And so whenever you see zeal talked about in the Bible, it's this idea of love for God, love for God's righteousness, but it had taken on this idea of even being willing to do violence in pursuit of God's righteousness. That is the model for Paul. He's looking at these Christians that are now worshiping a man, and he's saying, this is a problem. This doesn't fit within Judaism. This doesn't fit within our creed, our prayer that we recite each day. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. No, you can't worship this God, Jesus. That doesn't fit. And so he's trying to, in order to bring about God's plan for his people, he's trying to join with his Pharisee brothers in stamping out anything that's keeping the people from being God's people. He's trying to stamp out anything that threatens their devotion to God. So he's going out and having Christians arrested and brought in to before the Sanhedrin. In particular, he probably also thinks that there's something wrong with Jesus, not just because of his claims, but Deuteronomy 21:23 points out that anyone who is hung on a tree is cursed. Jesus was crucified on a wooden cross. And so in his mind, that is a clear indication this is a cursed man. We cannot allow this heresy to persist if we're going to be God's people and if we're going to see God do what we hope we'll see him do through our people.
Listen, he was already seeing, he already knew that Christ was going to be crucified, so that's why he had this thought of that Christ?
No, in Acts 8:1, Christ had already been crucified.
Okay.
So that was already a known factor. So yeah, we don't know if Paul knew about Jesus during Jesus' life on earth. If he's studying in Jerusalem, it seems like he might have, but there's so much that goes on, especially around Passover when Jesus is there and when the crucifixion is there. And there were a lot of crucifixions that go on. So Paul wouldn't necessarily have noticed if just another, forgive the callousness, if just another Jew is being crucified. That was not a news-making thing in and of itself. So Paul likely thinks he's doing God's work. He goes to Damascus, as many of us are familiar with. He goes there to arrest more Christians. So he's being very proactive now to say, we're going to track this down and we're going to stomp it out. And then as he goes, his life is changed. Now, in this book, in this biography of Paul, N.T. Wright, who's a brilliant scholar, makes an interesting proposal. He just has us imagine, what was Paul thinking about on the way to Damascus? And he says, there's a very well-known passage at the beginning of Ezekiel, the prophet. And it's where Ezekiel is commissioned and he sees the throne of God. He sees the whirling wheels at the feet of the throne of God. And he looks up and he sees the waist of God. And then he sees the glory of God. And he falls down on his face. And Tom Wright's suggestion is this may be the passage that Paul is is meditating on Ezekiel, and he's reading or reciting to himself about the whirling wheels, the throne of God, and looking up, and then Jesus appears to him in the light. And what does Paul do? He goes down on his face. It's a fascinating proposal. None of us will ever know if it's true until we get to heaven. But boy, it sure makes you think. It at least helps you, it gives you a good idea of the kinds of ideas that were in Paul's head. And it helps us also get a sense of how earth-shattering it was for Paul to be face-to-face with Jesus, this guy who he thought was dead, and now he has to reconcile everything. He has to rethink, what does it mean that this Jesus is alive? Well, it means that his claims are probably true. What does it mean then if he says he's the Son of God? How does this fit? You have Paul there in Damascus for 3 days blind, and you got to imagine he is just going over and over and over again what has happened and trying to make sense of Jesus being crucified and resurrected, and how does this fit with everything that he's believed and understood before.
Do you have a chapter for the Ezekiel?
Yeah, that's Ezekiel 1.
Okay.
So, Acts 9, after Saul's conversion, he spent many days in Damascus. He goes out after Ananias comes to him and prays with him, and the scales fall from his eyes. He goes out and he begins debating in the synagogue right away that Jesus is the Messiah. And of course that gets people in an uproar, and he ends up having to be forced to leave the city under cover of night in a basket just to get out. One of the great stories from Sunday school days for me. He then spent some time in the desert of Arabia, and then later returned to Damascus. We see this in Galatians 1. We don't know anything about what goes on there at Arabia. Again, looking to Tom Wright, his suggestion is that he goes back, the Arabia desert is near where the thought is Sinai was. And so he's proposing this may be Paul going back, just almost on a pilgrimage, going back to Mount Sinai where the law is given in order to pray and seek the Lord's guidance, in order to kind of put together the puzzle of everything that he's believed, now making sense with Jesus at the center of it. So if you think about it this way, what Paul experiences, it's not just a conversion. It has to be like a conversion of the way that he reads the Bible. He's had a way of understanding it. This isn't a guy who's brand new to the faith. He's known it very, very well. But he's had ideas or leanings for how it's going to go. And with Jesus being God's Messiah, he has to learn to rethink a lot of it. It's like if you had a kaleidoscope and you had to kind of twist it so that the images come together in a different way in order to make sense. It's a really different understanding for him, and it takes some time to rethink it. Well, 3 years pass after his conversion. We estimate his conversion at about 33 AD. I think I skipped that in your notes. And so approximately 3 years later, AD 36, Saul goes to Jerusalem, and he met with Peter and James, the half-brother of Jesus. Barnabas actually introduced Saul to them. If you recall, in Acts 9, it says that the other believers were afraid of him. He gained a reputation already among the Christians. They're saying, "Yeah, we don't trust that guy." And so Barnabas goes and introduces them, makes peace, and then Saul is sent back to his hometown of Tarsus. Now, we have no idea what he does. There's about 10 years of it's estimated anyway, that we don't know what Paul is doing. We can assume that he is sharing the gospel. Part of the way we assume that, if you look at 2 Corinthians 11, he's talking about some of the things that have occurred to him, and he mentions his persecutions. He mentions a stoning, which we read about in Acts. He mentions being shipwrecked and out on the open ocean for, I think, a couple of days. We don't see that anywhere. There's a shipwreck afterwards where he lands right there on the land. There's a number of different imprisonments and beatings that he deals with that we don't have a record of. So we get a pretty good sense that Paul's out doing ministry in ways that we don't know, and he's facing opposition. Now, we get to the end of that kind of unknown time, and Barnabas takes Saul from Tarsus to Antioch in Syria. And this is in 46, and they stay on doing the work for a year. Barnabas goes there because there's a number of Jews that have gone up, Jewish Christians that have gone up, and they've started to share the gospel, and all these Gentiles are coming to faith. Not becoming Jewish first, not converting via circumcision. They're just accepting Christ. And they're receiving the Holy Spirit. And so Barnabas is seeing this. He recognizes the work of God. He says, we need to have somebody help me teach these people. So he goes and gets Saul, the Pharisee, to come and to teach these Gentile believers the Word of God. And they continue there for some time. And I believe that takes us to the end of our notes. Am I right on that? Okay.
You went a little beyond.
Did I go a little bit beyond that? All right. I have two different iterations of notes. I realized that I got in here with.
So his unknown years were between what and what?
Between 36 and 46. And that's an estimate. And in a couple of weeks, I'll tell you, we do have a pretty good bedrock for how we estimate Paul's timeline. We've got one point where his life intersects with a Roman, or actually a Corinthian official. And we have an inscription that nails that down within about 9 months. And so that's a pretty cool thing for us to be able to see and to recognize that. So anyway, this open question time, I've kind of flied through this. I'll just say this in particular, because we're dealing with a lot of background, this is kind of the session where things kind of are a little slow. So if there's, I'll just say, that's my plug for, it's not all this much talking. We're going to really get into fun in the coming weeks. But questions?
I thought it was
Start
really
them.
interesting.
All right.
I have two questions.
Okay.
When did his name change from Saul to Paul?
Mm-hmm.
Because hasn't that already happened?
No.
Okay. And how do you spell Phineas?
All right. Phineas, Phineas.
E-A-S.
Yeah.
Okay.
His name in the scriptures, he starts being referred to as Paul in Acts 13. I don't remember the exact verse, but it's while he's on a missionary journey. And that's actually the reason for the switch. And here's the thing. I'm going to dispel what we've all thought. It's probably not a name change. He probably just starts going by his last name. Paulus is a Roman name. Paul, we know from his later, the account in Acts, is a Roman citizen. We see him in Acts 13. He goes to the island of Cyprus. And he goes before there's an official there whose name is Sergius Paulus. Yeah, this is in 13 verse 7. He's an attendant of the proconsul, Sergius Paulus. It is a guess, but it, I think, is a reasonable one, that Paul's father or other descendant may have been related to this man from working together. He may have earned his citizenship or been given his citizenship by his connection either with this Sergius or their lines had some connection down the way. What we know is it was common in the Roman time for them to have three-part names, just like many of us do, a first, middle, and last name. Now, Saul is a strong Jewish name. It goes back to Saul the king. As a Pharisee, you're looking to name, names matter back then. And so you wouldn't name your kid loser or, anything. You would name him like cool names, strong names, like stuff that would kind of communicate your ambitions for him, even more so than now. Saul, of course, we know that he wasn't a good king in the end, but he was the first king of Israel. It gets back to that hope of what they think what they're hoping they'll see God do. It's a very reasonable first name for a Jewish boy with a devout family. But Saulus in Greek means to, it has a negative connotation. It's like, if I were to say you acted in a Saulus way, it would be like you're loose or a floozy or, it's really negative. And so it would be like he's walking into these Greek cities and they don't know Saul the king. They don't recognize the regalness of that name. They hear him with a funny, demeaning first name. And so he's like, like when I was in India, I'd go and they'd introduce me and they just never could hear the difference between Doug and dog. And so I would, it became kind of a bit. Doug, yes, not woof woof dog, no. And but that was just the difference when you're communicating cross-culturally. It really makes a lot of sense, and this is coming from my Paul Prof. Randy Richards, that it was probably a very pragmatic reason like that Paul goes by his last name, Paulus, a Roman name, rather than continue to be called by Saul with its negative connotations. Again, this is one of those things that is... that makes a lot of sense. It's not guaranteed. If you don't like it, you don't have to believe that. You're not rejecting Scripture or anything. But it really is a reasonable explanation, I think. Richard.
Would Pharisees have been expected to marry? I mean, we never hear anything about Paul having a wife or kids, but
yeah,
you would think that the law was kind of directing people.
Marriage was very much practice, very common, very expected in Judaism. It goes back to Genesis 2. You're expected to marry and to bear fruit and multiply, to populate the earth. Here's the thing. 1 Corinthians 7. Paul talks about singleness, and this is the best estimate we get into it. He says... now, I wish let's see. This is 1 Corinthians 7, verse 8. Now, to the unmarried and to the widows, I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I am. Here's the thing. Verse 8. To the unmarried. That word is agamos. It can also mean widower. So it could read, not necessarily, because he's got a word for those who've never married early. He calls them virgins. He says, now to the virgins, here's my commands for you. Now to the unmarried and the widows. And it seems like that's a pretty good grouping of widowers and widows. If there's not a word for, or not a well-known word for widower, it makes a lot of sense that Paul could be in that class, that he is a widower, that his wife had died. From what we know of, again, getting back to the mortality rates, women dying in childbirth very regularly. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I wrote a short paper on that in college, and yeah, that's what I think. Another possibility is that she could have been from an equally devout Jewish family, and he's worshiping this Jesus guy, and her father says, no, you're not being a part of that. And parents could absolutely break a marriage like that. That was very common at that time. So, yeah, that's right. Shotgun unwedding. That happened. In the Roman world, that happened if a higher quality spouse was available. You could upgrade your daughter by choice. So anyway, no comment on that. But anyway, yeah, that's a good question. I think it makes sense Paul was probably married. The stage in life that he is, when he accepts Christ, if he would have been about 30, yeah, he probably would have been married by that point. But again, speculation, but it's a reasonable answer. What other questions do you have, Anita?
How did he have the means to travel to all these places?
Great question. He identifies, he writes this, and I don't recall exactly where he writes this, but he talks about, well, it's in 1 Corinthians 9. He talks about how he supports himself. In Acts, it records that he was a tent maker. Now that is probably more than that. It's probably like leather worker. Tent worker could include not just making tents, but doing leather work. And if you could imagine him having tools, just a small couple of tools, it'd be a very mobile kind of tool pack that he could keep with. So that job, that particular skill would serve him well. But other times he's supported. We see him being financially supported by Lydia in Philippi. She's a wealthy woman. She welcomes him into her home. So we do, it is something where Paul is absolutely, as a traveling teacher, going to have some that support him, and sometimes he rejects that support because gifts always have strings attached. And that's just the way that the world worked then. And so sometimes he accepts the patronage, sometimes he rejects it, depending on the circumstances. But he's able to work and to support himself. He alludes to that here. I want to say it's in Acts 18 when he's in Corinth that he is supporting himself. And then when his partners, when Timothy and Titus and Silas, or I guess Timothy and Silas join up with him, then he devotes himself fully to preaching the gospel. You see that mentioned there. So a few different ways. One thing that we also need to acknowledge, in our world, everybody gets to go to school. Not in their world. There wasn't a public school that was publicly funded. And so for Paul to get to study, his family we're probably talking like the equivalent of a middle class. They're well enough that he could afford to study and afford to go abroad to study. The way that you would pay it, that teachers were supported is students would pay them. That's how a teacher made his living. And so for Paul to be able to study as well as he did, yeah, they were not a poor family. It's not accurate to say he would be wealthy, but upper middle class.
Do you really know anything about his family?
Not much, other than his father was a Pharisee. They were living in Tarsus. His father was a Roman citizen. Paul says that I was born with my citizenship, meaning his father would have been a Roman citizen. And they were living in Tarsus, which means for whatever reason, they're not Jerusalem Jews. They're Palestinian, or they're diaspora Jews, I should say. I don't know if we can read a lot into their beliefs with that, but there's some amount of mixing with the Greek culture there, which some of the people in Jerusalem, some of the strict Jews in Jerusalem, would look down on that to a certain amount. Jason.
You point out that you met Peter and James through walking. How did you know walking? How were they connected?
Barnabas goes to him. This is in, I believe it's in Acts 9. Yeah, we don't know anything more than in verse 27. Barnabas, if you back up to 26, when he came to Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him, not believing that he really was a disciple. But Barnabas took him and brought him to the disciples. So I don't know that they knew each other other than Barnabas. Barnabas is one of these guys that his name means son of encouragement, and that's a nickname. His full name is Joseph. He's one of these guys that is willing to risk. He believes in the redemption story. He believes, man, it's worth a risk to just go talk to this guy. And he makes peace a number of different times. Sometimes he's redeeming his own kin. We'll see that next week with John Mark. But I think Barnabas just says, hey, this is worth a shot. We do know Barnabas is a wealthy guy, so maybe he's looking at his stature thinking, I can go, I've got the clout to go and just to find out, and I'm not risking what these other guys are. He might think that he can buy, if Saul is doing an undercover thing for the rest of the Pharisees, Sanhedrin, he might be able to buy his way out of it or have enough clout that they'll turn aside. That happens to this day. That's just how the world works. I've got an interesting story about that for later in the Paul study. What other questions do we have? Okay. Well, I do have the answer sheets up here. Let me encourage you. All right, so there's no homework.
Yeah, there is too.
There's not. Oh, there's a lot of scriptures to look up. Yeah, that's true. Do that. If you don't want to do any homework, that's great. Don't. That's part of the bargain. If you want extra credit, you can read those scriptures. Read Acts 8 through 13, and that kind of gets the Bible, the flow from Acts anyway. That'll cover to where we are. And next week we get into Paul's missionary journeys. And this is where it gets exciting, because this is where Paul starts getting into trouble. Where we start seeing the gospel on the road in real life situations. And it's a whole lot of fun. So let me pray for us, and then we can be dismissed. Father, thank you so much for, God, for the opportunity to come together and study your word and to be with our brothers and sisters together, and to just remember that you have worked through people, ordinary people, to advance your kingdom. And Paul is another example of that. So I pray, Father, that as we study his story, that we would get a better sense of what you are calling us to do and how you're at work through each and one of our lives. And so bless our time together in Jesus' name. Amen.